Alright, so I'm recording this on October 1st. It is the early afternoon. So this is being recorded prior to tonight's AFC Championship preview between the Broncos and Jets. This podcast probably won't be released until Friday. And on this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be ranking the 32 NFL head coaches. And so I want everybody to consider a situation, a hypothetical situation, where every NFL player and every NFL coach and assistant coach becomes a free agent. The 32 franchises basically all have blank slates. The franchises are randomly ordered 1 through 32, right? And so the first franchise gets the first pick. Any franchise can draft any player or coach. I wonder how many players would be selected before a head coach would be selected, because for me, I would, assume in that hypothetical situation that Patrick Mahomes would go first, Russell Wilson would go second, and then I think third pick, you're probably choosing legitimately between, your coach of choice. I don't know if that's Belichick or Andy Reid or, Kyle Shanahan versus the remaining quarterbacks. You've got Aaron Rodgers, more of a veteran guy, and then there's, the younger unproven guys like Watson and Lamar Jackson. I just think it's an interesting discussion. The point, I think, is that coaching is pretty crucial. I think it's a critical component of any NFL organization. The analysis of NFL head coaches is really a two-pronged discussion. So my criteria kind of boils down to two things. Firstly, it's how well do the coaches exploit inefficiencies, basically like how good is their process, and I'll get into more details in a minute about that. Secondly, it comes down to execution. What are their results? What's their win percentage? What kind of performance have they been getting out of their players? And also, who are they employing as offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, etc. Going back to the exploiting of inefficiencies, this kind of is an umbrella term for a lot of different things. There's in-game decision-making, which I think is pretty crucial. I've known for a while now that fourth downs are, pretty important. Teams should be going for fourth downs a lot more frequently than they currently do. I will say that, a lot of coaches have probably been introduced to the math behind why fourth downs are basically an inefficiency right now in the NFL. And, as a result, we've seen more coaches, more teams go for it on fourth downs more frequently in the past, couple of seasons especially. 2-point conversions are another thing to keep in mind. I also, value play calling a lot. And, when certain plays are called, what types of plays, there are definitely some edges to be had based on play calling. And personally, I think offense is more, important and stable in the long run than defense is. So, a good offensive play caller will generally have a little bit of an edge in my mind than a good defensive play caller. In addition to the in-game decision-making, there's also the off-season decision-making. So, and this is a tough one, but putting together the team in the off-season, certain coaches probably have a much bigger role in constructing the roster than other coaches do. So that's kind of a tough one to evaluate at certain times. But it is important to at least consider what are coaches doing with draft capital? How are they spending it? Are they trading up a lot? Are they trading down and rolling it over to future seasons, which is tends to be a good thing over time. And then how are they allocating their cap space? Are they allocating it kind of randomly, or are they doing it in a way where they are honoring positions of value. Are they, is a running back getting paid a ton on this team? Are there super expensive guards and defensive tackles, or is this team, kind of focusing on quarterback and also prioritizing, players in the secondary and wide receivers and whatnot? So, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Obviously, that one's tougher to evaluate because not every coach has the same amount of power within their respective organization. So basically the prompt for this exercise is, regardless of the rest of the roster, if you, just started out with a clean blank slate, which head coach would you want, in order to kind of maximize the probability of you winning over time? Which coaches in order kind of give you the most probability points on their own. So at number 32, I've got M.Patricia. I think Patricia is the weakest coach in the NFL right now, coach of the Detroit Lions. His regular season record is 10-24-1. He has a 30% winning percentage, has not coached a playoff game. It's kind of funny because, earlier in the offseason, Lions over 6.5 wins was a really popular bet. Lions at all kinds of different price points to win the NFC North was popular. I remember back in March or February, I took Lions plus 900 to win the NFC North. I had a little bit on their over 6.5 wins because, they have a good passing efficiency offense. They were supposedly, going to have good coverage players. At least I thought that, on paper, this team looked pretty good. I guess luckily for me, I didn't, do anything more than just sprinkle a little bit of money on the Lions, the pro Lions bets, because, in the back of my head, I just knew, as much as I like this roster and I think Stafford is slightly undervalued, coaching isn't trivial. And M.Patricia, I thought going into this year was, among the worst coaches in the league, and, I've got him ranked last year. The Lions defense, since Patricia has started as the head coach in Detroit, has been awful. And it really wasn't that good in New England either. I'm at a point now where I feel like Patricia's done less with more than any coach in the league. I mean, this roster in Detroit isn't really that bad. The defense shouldn't be this bad. He had Darius Slay. Now they bring in Okudah and Trufant. They've got, pieces on this defense. I'm at a point now where I probably wouldn't trust him as a defensive coordinator. I don't think I'd want him necessarily. He's kind of comes across as a little bit egotistical and kind of narrow-minded in his press conferences. I don't really get a good vibe from him either. I just don't like it. I think, it's pretty obvious to me that Jim Caldwell, who in 4 seasons as the Detroit Lions head coach prior to Patricia's tenure, averaged 9 wins a season. And the Detroit ownership group still decided to fire him and bring in Patricia, and Patricia's won 10 games in 2 years. So it's really, kind of mind-boggling to me how Caldwell got ousted for Patricia. But anyway, yeah, I've got M.Patricia ranked last. At number 31, I've got J.Judge. It's only been 3 games so far, but man, it has been bad for the Giants. So look, I'll admit that the Giants did a decent job in the draft, I thought, this past offseason. I thought this was one of their better drafts, one of the better ones they've had in a long time. It was, competent. They didn't do anything ridiculous. But, again, J.Judge, I just feel like, he doesn't make any good 4th down decisions. He hasn't done any so far. The team has been awful. Daniel Jones has looked horrible so far. The defense has been bad. I'm not a huge fan of the Belichick coaching tree. I am a big fan of Belichick, but just not the guys who he allows to leave, because those guys tend to struggle. Jason Garrett is the offensive coordinator on this team. Freddie Kitchens is the tight ends coach on this team. It's a really goofy coaching staff, and I think some of that is on J.Judge for employing guys who I just think were pretty incompetent for a long time. The last thing I'll mention about J.Judge here, and it's kind of a tricky point to make, but basically, I'm not a fan of Dave Gettleman. I think he's one of the weaker GMs in the league. The fact that Gettleman kind of, gave J.Judge like a stamp of approval, I'm kind of reaching into my pocket and tossing the red flag out there. I think that's a negative for J.Judge, to be completely honest. I mean, I know I'm cherry picking a little bit with like an anti-Gettleman argument, as an argument against J.Judge, but, Gettleman took a running back second overall, and there's still people that think that was a good selection, and I just can't believe that Gettleman still has a job, quite frankly, because it's just been a lot of mistakes, and he's really put together like a strange and incompetent roster. I don't think J.Judge is in a position to be successful, but man, it's been bad so far. So I've got him at 31. At number 30, I've got M.Rhule from Carolina. The team is 1-2 so far. I think they've looked okay in the games that he's coached so far. I mean, they've competed. They competed in Week 1 against the Raiders. They won outright against the Chargers in Week 3. I was kind of halfway out on Rhule before the 2020 season even started, though, and that's why he's ranked pretty low. I didn't like the offseason. I didn't like the moves they made. I just thought it was weird that they gave Bridgewater that much money and they didn't really bring in a backup. And then, the counterpoint is like, well, they may have been tanking, but they really weren't, because then they signed guys like Robbie Anderson, and, they brought in a bunch of defensive players from their draft. I didn't really love the defensive tackle, Derek Brown, 7th overall. I thought that was a little bit egregious, kind of a level of obliviousness to positional value. And then, to kind of double down on that, he gives McCaffrey an enormous contract, and, we've seen time and time again that paying any running back just doesn't make sense, if you want to build a great football team. I understand that maybe ownership was pushing him to do that because it's like, hey, we sell a lot of McCaffrey jerseys, but, at the same time, I don't think that was really that good of a move when it comes down to like building a good football team. I think that was a very large percentage of a cap going towards, a pretty replaceable position. So I'm not that high on M.Rhule, but, so far the Panthers have looked, reasonable, I would say. So at number 29, I've got V.Fangio. He's 7-12 so far, 36.8% winning percentage. I think Fangio is a plus defensive coordinator. I think he's a good defensive coordinator. I think, he's really struggled because John Elway has given him Joe Flacco and Drew Lock and Jeff Driscoll to work with. It's hard to win games when those are your quarterbacks, so I kind of don't really have a fully formed opinion of Fangio yet. It is clear that he doesn't like going for it on 4th downs, and he's not super aggressive. He's a lot more conservative with that kind of stuff, but at the same time, given the quarterbacks he's been working with, I don't know if I would be dying to go for it on 4th down either necessarily, because, part of going for it on 4th down means that you have at least a little bit of faith in your offense that you're going to, get the average yards per play that you need to go for it in certain situations. So at 28, I've got Jon Gruden. He's 108 and 103 in the regular season as a head coach, good for 51.2%. 5-4 as a playoff head coach. I wanted to bring up a point about Gruden is that, he's 13-22 since he's signed with the Raiders. That's only a 37% winning percentage. He's been bad since he's been a coach of the Raiders, and I would say his contract looked egregious at the time, and I would say it looks pretty bad right now as well. The Khalil Mack trade was, I think, ultimately a good trade for him because he freed up cap space and he brought in a lot of young talent with the draft capital. But again, there was always kind of like a level of obliviousness to positional value the whole time. It was like, yeah, we're going to take Josh Jacobs in the first round. We're going to, take Cleveland Farrell fourth, even though he would have been there probably, 6-7 spots later. Throughout the entire kind of rebuilding process with the Raiders so far, Gruden has never really addressed the quarterback position. Like Derek Carr is still the quarterback. It's still pretty clear he's below average. I just kind of wish that he at least, fired a shot at a quarterback that he wanted. I kind of feel like that would help his case one way or the other a little bit more. At least we'd have a more definitive result to go off of. But so far, Gruden's been bad. 13-22 as a Raiders head coach. I think his contract is ridiculous. I think he's a little bit of a clown, to be honest with you. I thought, his Monday night stuff was kind of mediocre at best. I didn't think he was a great analyst on TV. So, I'm out on John Gruden as a head coach. Number 27, I've got Z.Taylor from Cincinnati. So he's 2-16-1 so far in his coaching career. That's, it's pretty weak. He's in Hugh Jackson's neighborhood with respect to winning percentage. It's been bad so far, but he hasn't had a lot to work with. I don't think this team is drafted remarkably well, but they haven't been bad. I thought the Jonah Williams pick in 2019 was okay. Obviously, the Burrow pick this year was pretty good. I think Burrow is going to be a good quarterback for a long time. They've done some things that I liked. In 2019, to be fair, AJ Green missed the whole year. He was one of their best players. And, the thing that I would be worried about, I think, is that the defense has been atrocious since Taylor has been there. And part of being a head coach is, focusing on both sides of the ball. I think the Bengals have a pretty bright future. I'm not 100% sure if Taylor is going to be the coach long-term for Cincinnati, but, at least they have Burrow. They have some pretty good young receivers. I like Tyler Boyd. I like, T. Higgins has been okay so far. So I think the future is relatively bright for Cincinnati. I just think, Taylor is a guy who it's hard to be in on him right now. He's won 2 games out of, 19 total games coached. The other thing is that he doesn't really go for it on fourth downs very much at all. He's not very aggressive, so that's also kind of a problem for right now. At number 26, I've got Doug Marrone. Doug Marrone in his coaching career, 38-47 regular season record, 44.7 winning percentage. He's 2-1 in the playoffs. I think everybody was kind of, thinking Doug Marrone would be the first coach fired this year, and the Jags have been pretty good. They've been good. Minshew deserves some credit. It's hard for me to put Marrone any higher than where he is. I just think he's a reasonable coach. He's been given a lot of bad rosters, which kind of explains his record. I don't think he's as bad as the guys below him on this list, basically. So number 25, I've got Adam Gase from the New York Jets. Probably the new favorite to be first coach fired this year. I don't know if I would bet on him necessarily with, there are some other guys. I think Patricia, Dan Quinn, Mike Zimmer, some other guys floating around, I think, that could be fired before him. But Adam Gase, so he's 30-37 as a regular season head coach, 44.8 winning percentage. He's 0-1 in the playoffs. So I kind of have a hard time, kind of figuring out what I should make of his coaching career because, I go back and I think about Miami. He coached Miami from 2016 to 2018. In 2016, he took kind of a weak Dolphins team led by Matt Moore to the playoffs with a 10-6 record. They lost in the first round. The 2017 season, it was the Tannehill was gone for the year season, so Cutler was in. They went 6-10 that year, kind of a messy season. But then in 2018, kind of strangely, Tannehill had one of his weaker seasons as a pro, and this team that really probably should have won like 3 or 4 games ended up going 7-9. Kind of a bizarre, coaching record there, track record, because I think all of those Miami teams were worse on paper than what they turned out to be. So I feel like he actually made more with less happen with the 3 years in Miami. And now I'm looking at him with the New York Jets, and it's like, well, he's been the coach of the Jets for 19 games. He's 7-12, but he's only 7-9 in games where Sam Darnold starts. So, and I don't even think Darnold is good. And so that's kind of the thing, is like, his record is weirdly competent, I think. I have him ranked 25th. I don't think he's amazing, but I think most people would probably pin him as like the worst coach in the league. I do think there's a handful of guys that are worse than Adam Gase at this point, but I understand that I'm one of the last people who still kind of is halfway in on Gase, where I can support him a little bit. I will say that like some of the rumors about how he's had negative relationships with offensive players on his teams, that's not great. I don't think that's like a great look to have. He traded Jay Ajayi, who, to be fair, like was out of the league about a year and a half after he was traded. But the Jarvis Landry thing, he traded Jarvis Landry because he didn't want him on the team. Just kind of a bad mixing of ideas or something between the two of them. So, it's not all good, but I have Adam Gase ranked 25th among the 32 NFL head coaches. So number 24, I've got Anthony Lynn. Anthony Lynn's record is 27-25 in the regular season, almost 52%, 1-1 in the playoffs. So the biggest knock on Anthony Lynn is that his in-game decision-making is terrible. Like the 4th down stuff, when he chooses to go for it, when he doesn't, is really bad. He has single-handedly kind of given away a lot of close games. And I think the average fan probably isn't super keen on that, but his decision-making is part of the reason why the Chargers always have these, large amounts of losses by 7 points or fewer. The other issue, I think, with Anthony Lynn is that the Chargers as a drafting team, right? Because I think Lynn does have a lot of input into how his team drafts, which is, a little bit of he's a little bit of an outlier when it comes to some of the weaker head coaches I have on this list, because, a lot of the other coaches aren't as involved in their drafting. I think Lynn is relatively involved. And so, the 2018 draft, when they got Derwin James, I thought that was great. In 2019, I thought they also made some good decisions. But in 2020, they take Herbert, and, personally, I don't like Herbert, but we can agree to disagree. But then they trade up for Kenneth Murray, later in the first round. I just think he kind of proved to me that, like, the Chargers don't really get it when it comes to managing draft capital and assets like that, because trading up for a guy like Murray just made zero sense, and it was a very shrewd move by New England as usual. The good news for Anthony Lynn is that I think, the team looked pretty well prepared in the playoff game against Baltimore in Lamar Jackson's rookie season. They did a really good job defensively. He seems to be, willing to adapt, which is good. And, they looked good in week 2, I guess, against the Kansas City Chiefs, even though they blew that game too. But, overall, I think he's a potential candidate to get fired. I think he's going to have a longer leash than most people, because based on everything that I hear from around the league, it's like people seem to like him. People seem to think he's a really good guy, and so that's good. But again, I think there are some fundamental flaws with him. All right, at number 23, I've got Dan Quinn, 43-40 regular season, 3-2 in the playoffs. I don't know how he hasn't gotten fired yet. I think he will get fired before the season is over, unless the Falcons go on some kind of, crazy run. look, the bottom line is just that he's done a lot less with more. You know, he's had a top 8 quarterback for a while now. He's had an elite receiver, another good receiver in Ridley. Dan Quinn's specialty is supposed to be to help the defense get better. This defense has been so abominable the past, 3-4 seasons here. It's really inexcusable. You know, I get it, like there's injuries happen and stuff, but I mean, I feel like the better defensive minds out there could probably make do better with what Quinn has been working with. So, I have to put Dan Quinn relatively low on this list. At 22, I've got Bill O'Brien, 52-47 regular season record as a head coach. He's 2-4 in the playoffs. So Bill O'Brien has gotten some good quarterback play out of, some unexpected names over the years. His record was surprisingly bad, I thought, considering how many times I remember Houston winning the AFC South. Maybe that 4-12 season was kind of weighing it down, but here's where I'm at with O'Brien. Good on you for finding Deshaun Watson and developing him. Shame on you for taking everything on the roster and throwing it away to make Deshaun's life as hard as possible. If Bill O'Brien wants to continue to be the coach, that's fine. He's an embarrassment as a general manager. He is easily the worst GM in the league. He's like the guy in the fantasy league who you're just sending trade after trade to, like, oh, what do you think of this guy? What do you think of this guy? One of them's going to eventually hit and you're going to cash in and get a ton of value for some players you weren't expecting to trade away. I just can't believe that, on top of giving away 2 first-round picks and a second-round pick for Laramie Tunsil, and then paying him more than any other offensive tackle in the league, which just fundamentally doesn't make sense because you're giving up so much draft capital and cap space. You're basically giving up 5 or 6 players worth of money for this one player who is a decent player but not amazing. On top of doing that trade, just trading away DeAndre Hopkins, one of the 5 best receivers in the league, and taking David Johnson's contract in exchange for a second-round pick. I mean, it's pretty inexcusable. At number 21, I've got R.Rivera. His record as a head coach, 77, 65-1, 54.2% winning percentage. He's 3-4 in the playoffs. Hopefully Rivera can get healthy. I think he's a reasonable coach. I thought he did a decent job with Carolina for a long time. Kind of was able to ride the Cam Newton roller coaster pretty well. Always seems to get a little more out of his defenses than I think people are expecting. Overall, I think he's just a reasonable coach, and I kind of trust him to not be completely incompetent. All right, at number 20, I've got Brian Flores. He's 6-13 with Miami so far, 31.6 winning percentage. So he's ranked relatively high on this list considering his winning percentage. I've been pleasantly surprised by Flores. I think he's done a reasonable job. I think the way Miami kind of executed their rebuild very, very decisively, I think it was really well done. I think the front office in Miami deserves credit. Flores deserves credit for winning 5 games with a team that probably should have won about 2. He got good play out of Fitzpatrick. The team got better as the season went along, which is kind of, a positive thing to build off of. And I thought they did a really good job with the draft capital that they stockpiled. The Tua Tagovailoa pick, I think, is going to prove to be a good one. And they did a good job of just kind of addressing needs. I wasn't crazy about every selection they made along the way, but overall, I think it was well done. They understood the value of the quantity of draft picks, and I think they executed a really good rebuild. And the team is good. The team is competent for what they are on the field. So it'll be interesting to see if he can take the step from being a guy who looks good when losing versus a guy who can win consistently. At number 19, I've got Mike Zimmer. His record as a head coach is 57-41-1, 58% winning percentage. He's 2-3 in the playoffs. So I give Bill O'Brien a lot of crap for ruining the Texans roster. I think Zimmer should actually get more crap than he does for what he's done with Minnesota's roster. Minnesota under 9 wins was one of my bigger plays this offseason, and this team has been atrocious so far. Here's the thing. They trade away their best offensive player in Stephon Diggs, okay? And Diggs, people don't know this maybe, but Diggs opened up a lot for Adam Thielen and others on that offense. They lose all 3 of their starting corners in the offseason. They try to replace those corners with other guys in the draft. The quantity of picks that they had in this past draft was pretty good. They had the extra first from the Diggs trade. They had, I think, an extra 3rd-round pick. They had a bunch of day 3 picks. That's all well and good, but, even the players they selected, I liked Justin Jefferson before the 2020 draft. I just thought, the picks of Gladney and Dantzler, I just thought they got kind of, the wrong couple of corners. I was more personally high on Jalen Johnson and Christian Fulton. Maybe it wasn't a seamless scheme fit, but I just thought that the Vikings kind of, were forcing themselves to take weaker players just to fit the scheme. In general, I just think, they paid a fullback in the offseason, they paid a punter, they signed a kicker. They just didn't really have a good grasp of positional value. And Zimmer seems to be really, old school. And he seems to like to run the ball a lot and to, control possession and not go for it on 4th downs and trust the defense, and all these old, kind of sayings are floating around the Vikings locker room. And I just think ultimately he's not exceptionally valuable anymore as a defensive coordinator, play caller. I think he's good, but I think it's not worth it for me to have him as a head coach because, he's going to make a ton of mistakes along the way with building the roster. So I've got Zimmer ranked relatively low here at 19. At number 18, I have the former Vikings offensive coordinator, Kevin Stefanski. So the Browns are 2-1 so far. I said it this offseason, I think Stefanski's a slightly better option as a head coach than Mike Zimmer, and I think the Vikings will ultimately regret not going with Stefanski. I thought Stefanski did a pretty good job with Kirk Cousins in 2019. I thought Cousins had one of his best seasons, and I thought the offense was pretty creative and, willing to adapt. I thought there were a lot of good things that Stefanski did. So far, I think the Browns have been a little bit disappointing. I would say mildly disappointing despite the 2-1 record. They got steamrolled by Baltimore week 1. And, they beat Cincinnati. They came out and kind of punched Cincinnati in the mouth a little bit, kind of, bullied them a little bit. The Browns probably should have lost to Washington in week 3. I thought they actually didn't play a very good game. And so, it hasn't been great so far, but I did like their draft in the offseason. I think, Grant Delpit being out for the year, maybe an underrated loss that people are forgetting about. But, overall, I think I still have a lot more trust in Stefanski than either of the other rookie head coaches. At number 17, I've got Mike Vrabel. His record as a head coach is 21-14 in the regular season, 60% winning percentage. He's 2-1 in the playoffs. I think Vrabel is just pretty good. I think he's good at making decisions in game. I think he's good at constructing rosters. I've actually thought Tennessee the past 2 or 3 years has been one of the more underrated drafting teams. I think in 3 straight years, I've absolutely loved their 2nd-round pick. In 2018, it was Harold Landry. 2019, A.J. Brown. 2020, Christian Fulton. I think they've done a pretty good job of constructing a very solid roster across the board. They've got a good offensive coordinator in place. Tannehill looks pretty darn good. He's been a lot better than anything we saw in Miami. And so I think Vrabel deserves credit, and I do like this team moving forward. I think Tennessee is in decently good hands with Vrabel. I would say Vrabel probably the best Belichick disciple right now, currently head coaching in the NFL. At number 16, I've got Matt LaFleur. LaFleur, 16-3, has a regular season head coach, over 84% winning percentage. He's 1-1 in the playoffs. So look, basically, he's ranked relatively low. He's got technically the highest win percentage of any coach in the NFL right now. I just think his win-loss record is really noisy. If you go back to the 2019 season, the Green Bay Packers probably should have won about 9-ish games, maybe 10, not 13. And so it was a little bit noisy that they got the bye and that, everything kind of worked out. They really should have lost to Detroit more than once, but they didn't. I want to give him credit because I think Rodgers has looked amazing so far in the 2020 regular season. I don't really know if that's a function of LaFleur, but it's fair to say that Rodgers, has looked really good this year. And it's been a while, I think, since Rodgers has played this well and he's willing to throw the ball downfield. My problem with LaFleur here is I think he's got a somewhat broken process. The 2020 draft was really bad for Green Bay. And I know it's not really showing up in the win-losses now because Rodgers is playing so well, but look, the Jordan Love pick, I fundamentally disagree with Jordan Love being a good quarterback, okay? A good quarterback prospect. That's fine. We disagree, but at least it's a quarterback. So they take a quarterback in the first round. Okay, whatever. Even if they traded up a few spots to do it, I'm not going to bury them for that. The A.J. Dillon pick in the second round was really startling. Going into that draft, I thought A.J. Dillon was going to be a 6th round pick at the highest. I don't think I've ever been more shocked to see somebody go as high in a draft as A.J. Dillon did. I think what made it even worse is that they had Aaron Jones. They had Jamal Williams. There's some other dude that was getting carries in the game against the Saints the other night, so A.J. Dillon is really the 4th running back on the depth chart. And they had a glaring need at receiver. So, look, I think the process is flawed with Green Bay. I think that even though Rodgers is playing really well right now, long-term, if Rodgers isn't a member of the Packers long-term, if LaFleur is their guy and they want to use him to build around, the draft picks like Jordan Love, A.J. Dillon, the tight end they took from Cincinnati in the 3rd round, those things are going to catch up to Green Bay. Those things aren't going to continue. You're not just going to get bailed out by Rodgers infinitely many times. It's going to catch up eventually, and Rodgers, is getting older as well. So the team looks great right now. I think LaFleur will continue to kind of stockpile wins. I think he'll have a really good win-loss record by the end of the season. I think Green Bay, is the 2nd best team right now in the NFC. But I'm not all the way in on LaFleur. I definitely have my reservations about him as a roster constructor. And then in addition to that, the Titans offense got better when he left. I think that's kind of a, worthwhile note to kind of keep on that. Tennessee definitely got better offensively when LaFleur stopped calling plays, when he went to Green Bay. At number 15, I've got Matt Nagy, 23-12 so far as a regular season head coach. That's over 65%. He's 0-1 in the playoffs. Similar to LaFleur, I think Nagy's record is really noisy, to be honest with you. The Bears are 3-0 right now. It's pretty fluky. I was on the Bears under going into this season. I frankly still feel okay about it. I definitely felt good about it before the Falcons game, but anyway, I think it's kind of a noisy result. The other way of looking at it is to say, well, Nagy is winning over 65% of his games with Trubisky as the quarterback, and Trubisky sucks. So part of me kind of wants to cut Nagy some slack, and the other part of me is kind of thinking, well, a lot of these wins are just kind of fluky. There's just not a lot of, consistency with this Bears team. Another kind of little thing in Nagy's favor is that he was a very good play caller in 2018. He did regress a little bit in 2019, but overall I still think he's a plus play caller offensively. The other thing is that he hasn't had a lot of draft capital to use because of the Khalil Mack trade. So that's kind of an important, side note here, is that he has been working with largely the same group of guys on the roster. There hasn't been as much turnover because they haven't had as many draft picks. So, I think that's kind of a worthwhile note. Overall, I think Nagy's okay. I'm still not 100% in on it. I kind of want to see him now with Foles as the quarterback, see what happens. There is kind of a baseline of trust I have because he's from the Andy Reid coaching tree. So at number 14, I've got Pete Carroll. He's 136, 90, and 1, 60% winning percentage. He's 11 and 9 in the playoffs. So Pete Carroll being at 14, I think, is going to surprise some people, may even disappoint and anger some people. Here's the thing with Carroll. I think he's a great person. He's got a lot of good energy to him. The prompt of this exercise is, who do you want as your coach regardless of the rest of the roster? If you gave Pete Carroll a blank roster, I think it could, there's a lot of simulations where it turns out really poorly for him. Basically what I'm saying is Russell Wilson has been carrying this team for a while now. And look, I don't think Carroll is terrible, okay? I don't think he's terrible. I have him ranked 14th, but this is coming from somebody who has a preseason Super Bowl ticket on Seattle. So I do believe in this team enough to say, yeah, Carroll can go back to a Super Bowl with Wilson. But of course, basically 100% of the reason why I made that bet is because Russell Wilson is the quarterback, and they've got great force multipliers on the offense like Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Here are the problems I have with Pete Carroll. There's a decent list here. As far as using draft capital, he took Rashad Penny in the first round in 2018. That was shocking, and he's done nothing for the team, which is pretty much what everyone predicted at the time. The Jordan Brooks pick in 2020 wasn't great either. In the 2019 draft, the Seahawks took L.J. Collier, a run-stopping defensive end. They took a box safety, Marquise Blair, and they traded down twice before they even took DK Metcalf. So as much as DK Metcalf has turned out to be a stud, I think the entire NFL really got him incorrect in a way, because he should have gone a lot higher than 64th overall or whatever it was. And, I just think the credit being given to Carroll in that case is kind of I kind of raise an eyebrow to that. He traded down twice and took two, pretty useless players in front of Metcalf. Basically, the bottom line is I don't think he's done a great job using draft capital. The other really crucial thing about Pete Carroll is that, for me, he's earned the nickname of Pete Field Goal Carroll because he loves to kick field goals on fourth downs. He doesn't like to go for it, even though he's got, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, maybe the best player in the NFL at quarterback. And, he's had that guy for the past few years. And then the other thing is all the second and long runs, It's just the idea in Carroll's mind that they've got to run the ball in order to, have it established or whatever to open up the passing game. It's just a really primitive way of looking at things in the NFL. I guarantee you, and he's learned a little bit because the Seahawks have been throwing the ball all over the yard in the first 3 weeks here of the 2020 season, but you don't need to have a good running game to establish or to have a good play action passing attack. And certainly not to have a good passing game in general, but play action is definitely independent of rushing efficiency. Anyway, Pete Carroll has a bunch of flaws in his process, but the results are there. And he seems like a good guy. I think that he's changed a little bit. He's, become a little bit more, eager to let Wilson throw the ball downfield more. So it's good that he's improving. I've got him ranked at 14. At number 13, I've got Sean McDermott from Buffalo. He's 28 and 23, 54.9% winning percentage in the regular season, 0-2 in the playoffs. So I'll give McDermott credit. I, going into this year, thought Josh Allen was one of the weaker quarterbacks in the NFL. Josh Allen's been pretty good, and the Bills actually do a lot of analytically sound things from a roster building perspective. They invested a lot in receiver. They signed John Brown, Cole Beasley. Now they trade for Diggs to make Josh Allen's life easier. They surround him with a good offensive line. They have done a good job defensively. McDermott's done a good job of building the defense from the back to the front. He understands that coverage is more valuable than pass rush. And so there's a lot of things I like about McDermott, and there's a lot of things I like about the Bills. I think they've been a pretty well-run organization so far, and they've taken Josh Allen to a much higher level of play than I thought he was capable of. At number 12, I've got Cliff Kingsbury from Arizona. He's 7-11-1, only a 39.5% winning percentage, has not coached a playoff game, and yet I have him ranked 12th. I think this is probably the most questionable ranking on my list of 32 here. So despite, not having coached a lot of games yet, and despite not really having, a great winning percentage so far, I really like Cliff Kingsbury. I like what I'm seeing out of him. If I were grading every offseason decision, over the past couple of years, I think the Arizona Cardinals would have one of the highest grades, probably the highest grade in the NFL for what they've done the past two off seasons. Ever since Kingsbury got there, he and Steve Keim have done a really remarkable job of building this team up. They start out by trading Rosen, moving off of Rosen for, a second-round pick after they select Kyler Murray first overall in the draft. That was absolutely the right decision. I think more teams should, pull the plug on quarterbacks when they don't look good right away. In addition to that, they get Byron Murphy, top of the second round. They made a bunch of other decent picks later in the draft. And then, in the 2020 offseason, they pulled off, I think, a masterful trade against Houston where, they get rid of David Johnson's contract. They also acquire one of the 5 best receivers in the NFL. And all they had to do was give up a second-round pick, like 40th overall or something for it. So that was amazing, I thought. One of the most lopsided trades I've ever seen. And, their 2020 draft was okay. I liked the Isaiah Simmons pick at 8. He has struggled so far, but I like where their heads were at with that one. I thought Simmons was one of the better prospects in this class. I thought he was better than the 8th overall pick. So generally I liked that. As far as on-field decision-making, Kingsbury hasn't really been all the way there with the 4th down stuff yet, but Kyler Murray has gotten better. I think that the way they're using him as a runner is really smart. I think Kingsbury has been an underrated slightly offensive play caller, so he's been good. The red flags with Kingsbury is that the defense has been really bad since he's been there, and that will have to change a little bit at least if this team wants to be a consistent playoff threat in what has become a really difficult division in the NFC West. So I'm in on Kingsbury. I liked him a lot, even before he coached a game, because of how good his offseason moves were. I think that he's probably one of the most underrated coaches in the public's eye, because I think he's had a hand really in shifting the Cardinals from being a reasonably good organization to one of the more savvy organizations and shrewd decision-making organizations in the NFL. At number 11, I've got Doug Pederson. He's 38-28-1 as a head coach in the regular season for Philadelphia, 57.5% winning percentage. He's 4-2 in the playoffs. So I always have kind of, some favoritism to Doug Pederson because he's really like the poster child for going for it on 4th downs. He was doing it before many of the other coaches were doing it, and so I give him credit for that. I think generally the Eagles do a pretty good job of, building decent rosters. I think he's got a pretty good grasp of positional value. I give Pederson credit for adjusting on the fly, whether that be mid-season or mid-game. The Eagles have had their backs against the wall a few times here in the past, few seasons. couple times it's been with Nick Foles, and Pederson wasn't afraid or hesitant at all to change the offense to make it easier for Nick Foles. And the Super Bowl run was interesting. I think Pederson deserves credit. I think he was a plus play caller. Part of me also kind of feels like it's kind of hard to explain the variance of Nick Foles in a way, so I don't want to give too much credit to Pederson when he may have been a little bit more along for the ride than people realize, especially with Frank Reich being there as well. One kind of underrated aspect of Pederson's coaching tenure so far in Philadelphia is that, and Eagles fans, maybe cover your ears here, but he might have taken an average-ish quarterback in Carson Wentz to decency. He may have been working with a pretty questionably accurate quarterback. I don't want to overreact too much to the 3 horrendous games Carson Wentz has had so far in 2020, but it was always weird to me that the team was a lot better with Foles under center. I'm starting to think that wasn't all just a coincidence. I think Wentz does have some flaws. This is definitely the worst football Wentz has played in his career, but I want to give Pederson some credit as an offensive design guy to potentially have taken Wentz from being about an average guy to an above average guy, and now of course it's not working out as well. The Eagles have been decimated with injuries on a couple different occasions, including right now during Pederson's time as head coach. But again, the 4th down decision making is good. The Super Bowl was great, and he's made a lot of good decisions with roster construction. I think the only red flag with Pederson is that there are times where I wish he wouldn't run the ball on 2nd and long so much. All right, at number 10, I've got Sean McVay from the Rams. He's got a 35-16 record as head coach in the regular season, 68.6 winning percentage, 2-2 in the playoffs. So the Rams are probably one of the teams I was most incorrect about going into the 2020 regular season. I was on their under 8.5 wins. It's not necessarily like a bet that's completely dead in the water right now, but the Rams have looked pretty good so far. Even in their loss, I thought they showed a lot of fight back in the game against Buffalo. They've been good. McVay deserves credit. He's a plus offensive play caller, play designer. The only negative I really have with McVay at this point is I'm wondering if he's going to be able to continue to adjust the way some of the more wizard-like coaches are able to. Some of the unicorns can really adjust on the fly. McVay has shown that he does have, kind of like a second gear to go to as a head coach. But, the other thing with McVay is I think the process has been a little bit shaky with the Rams. They've been giving away their first-round picks like every year. And that's not really a sustainable method to creating a good roster. They also haven't had large quantities of draft picks in general. It's not like they're trading back. They're just giving picks out. I thought they really, kind of mispriced Marcus Peters in the trade with Baltimore. They really just got like a backup linebacker in exchange for him. Then they turned around and traded Jalen Ramsey for 2 first-round picks. I just thought there was, kind of a weird miscalculation there where Marcus Peters is probably not like 2 first-round picks worse than Jalen Ramsey. Obviously, the Gurley contract, was a failure. I was a little disappointed that, with their shortage of draft capital and with the failure of the Gurley contract, they couldn't help but take Cam Akers in the 2nd round with their first pick of the 2020 draft. Not a super valuable, position, and Akers, looks like the 3rd best running back on his team anyway. So I didn't really, understand what that was all about. I think that there's still some flaws here with the Rams process, but, overall, I think McVay, the record kind of speaks for itself. He's been very sharp as a head coach with the play calling. The decision making is also something that he struggled with. He does not go for it on fourth downs like at all. He's one of the worst at going for it on fourth downs of any coach in the NFL, and you wouldn't think that because McVay is young and kind of, has the vibe of like someone who would, think outside the box a little bit more, but he really has kind of just ignored the fourth down decision making. So that's something that I'll be looking for him to work on moving forward. At number 9, I've got Mike McCarthy of the Cowboys. He's 126, 79, and 2 in his career as a regular season head coach. 61.4 win percentage. He's 10-8 in the playoffs. So McCarthy's kind of a tricky one to evaluate. Obviously, he had Aaron Rodgers for the longest time in Green Bay. They enjoyed a lot of success together. He did win a Super Bowl. I think he's probably slightly undervalued. I think most people think that Rodgers, carried them to the Super Bowl, but in reality, I think Green Bay, generally made good moves along the way. They definitely had good receivers over and over again. They found guys later in drafts. They, found good coverage players over time. So I think McCarthy probably gets shafted out of a little bit of credit there. And then, going into this year, after taking the year off, it's very clear to me that McCarthy studied a lot of the analytics with decision making before returning to the NFL. And that's a good thing. He's been going for fourth downs left and right, and it's been really good so far. I like what he's doing. I like the aggressiveness. He's going for it a lot more than the average head coach, and that's going to, over time, give the Cowboys extra possessions. He's going for 2-point conversions. I thought his draft was pretty analytically friendly. They take CeeDee Lamb when they, weren't pressed at the receiver position. Trayvon Diggs, I thought, was a good pick at the time in the second round. He's been getting beaten up a little bit so far in the first few weeks, but they've played good offenses, so we'll see if the defense kind of regresses over time. But the offense has looked great with Dak Prescott and all the weapons. So I'm still in on McCarthy being a pretty good coach. I don't love the Cowboys like necessarily this year, but I like McCarthy like long term as a pretty good head coach in the NFL, and he's already a pretty good offensive mind. You add in the decision making and the roster construction. I think it's a pretty good situation for him. At number 8, I've got Frank Reich from Indianapolis. He's got 16-0 as a record as a head coach in the regular season, 54.3 winning percentage, 1-1 in the playoffs. I like the Colts. I like their organizational integrity. I like Chris Ballard as a GM. They're good about trading down. They're good about kind of like using cap space the right way and always kind of having like some space available. I think the roster building element of this team is quite good. I think what's important to kind of consider with Frank Reich especially is that in 2018, he had Andrew Luck, and Andrew Luck plus quarterback, probably a top 8 quarterback in the NFL at that point. He was able to take Andrew Luck to an MVP caliber season, and the team won 10 games. Even the following year, in 2019, when Andrew Luck kind of, retired without warning, Jacoby Brissett and Frank Reich still won 7 games. And I think that's the mark of a really good coach, is where you get like a backup caliber quarterback in like Brissett, and you still take the team to win, 7 games. Like the team is still competent, and they're still, competing in every game. This year so far with Phillip Rivers, another new quarterback to start the season for Indianapolis, but it's been okay so far. They're 2-1. They've played kind of weak competition so far, so I'm still kind of not sure what to make of the Colts. I don't really know if I should be more like, kind of like concerned about them winning that division over Tennessee, or if, they should, more likely make it as a wild card team. It'll probably come down to Phillip Rivers, but I kind of just trust Reich. Carson Wentz had his best season when Frank Reich was in Philadelphia, and Nick Foles was probably better with Frank Reich in Philadelphia as well. I think he's a really good quarterback coach, and I think that's super important, and he's done a really good job so far as the head coach of the Colts. He's also shown the willingness to go for it on fourth downs. I think kind of a classic example is that, overtime decision against the Houston Texans that a lot of people criticized, but it was actually the right move. He's done a bunch of little good things that have kind of stockpiled for him, in my eyes, to being the 8th best coach in the NFL. At number 7, Mike Tomlin from the Pittsburgh Steelers. His record is 136, 74, and 1, 64.7 winning percentage, and he's 8-7 in the playoffs. So this is pretty high for a defensive-minded coach like Tomlin, but I got to give him credit. Like, his lowest win total as a head coach is 8 wins, in his career, and he's been a coach for a very long time. The winning percentage kind of speaks for itself. It's, close to 65%. I feel like the Steelers do a lot of things that kind of carry over season to season. They've been really good at drafting receivers. You just go back down through the list. It's like Mike Wallace to Antonio Brown to Juju Smith-Schuster. Now they've got, James Washington and Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool. Just all these, interesting and good offensive weapons. They've always kind of been good at that part of their team. And, in addition to that, this team defensively just tends to do a lot better than the projections would show, going into a season. So I think there's something to do there with Tomlin being a good plus defensive coach. And, this team has always been kind of resilient too. Last year, as much as I want to just fade every part of this whole 2019 season for Pittsburgh, he won 8 games with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. That's kind of unbelievable in a way, I mean, it'd be better if they, address the backup quarterback position, in a more intelligent way, but 8 wins with those 2 guys at quarterback is pretty remarkable. So Tomlin, I think, very consistent, very solid head coach. At number 6, I've got Bruce Arians in Tampa Bay. His record is 58, 40, and 1, a 59.1 winning percentage. He's only 1-2 in the playoffs, kind of a low amount of playoff games considering how many regular season wins he has and his winning percentage. I think maybe on multiple occasions he's had a winning record and not made the playoffs because, Arizona was in a really difficult NFC West back when he was the coach there. I think Arians is a kind of an interesting guy. I like a lot about him though. I think he's done a really good job of putting together defenses specifically. In Arizona, the Patrick Peterson, Antonio Cromartie, Tyrann Mathieu secondary was really good for a few years there, and those were during the good Carson Palmer years in Arizona. Now in Tampa Bay, he's built Jamel Dean and Carlton Davis as outside corners, Sean Murphy-Bunting as a slot corner, Antoine Winfield Jr. as a safety. I think that he's definitely got a good eye for picking out, good coverage players on the defensive side of the ball. And he definitely seems to understand that coverage is, more important than pass rush when constructing a defense. And so, the interesting part about him is that Arians is primarily an offensive-minded coach, but he's done, I would say, almost like a better job of putting together defenses. When you look at the teams that he's had offensively, and specifically the quarterbacks, so he's had Ben Roethlisberger, Andrew Luck, Carson Palmer, and then most recently Jameis Winston last season. Now he's obviously working with Tom Brady. Kind of an interesting and surprisingly sticky trend that I've noticed with Bruce Arians quarterbacks is that in the first year in the Bruce Arians offense, quarterbacks in that offense have extremely high interceptable pass rates and turnover play rates. It's kind of interesting to kind of note that. And then in several instances, the second season under Bruce Arians' supervision, the quarterbacks tend to do much better. So, as someone who does support Jameis Winston quite a bit, more than the average person, I think Jameis kind of got a raw deal here, not being able to see what he could do in year 2 of the Bruce Arians offense, just considering that even, less, turnover-prone quarterbacks like Roethlisberger and Luck also had really high interceptable pass rates during their first years with Bruce Arians. Part of the reason for that might just be because, Arians likes to do lots of 7-step drops, lots of deep routes downfield. He's good about, kind of drafting receivers that kind of help with downfield route running. The downside to an offense like that is that, sometimes if your offensive line isn't great, the offense really puts a lot of pressure on an offensive line. They have to block for longer amounts of time. Quarterbacks have to make probably more decisions under pressure than the average quarterback would. So it's kind of interesting. I do like Arians overall. I'm not particularly bullish on Tampa Bay this year, but I just like Arians as a coach. I think he would pass off as a relatively good general manager as well. So yeah, I've got him ranked at 6. At number 5, I've got Sean Payton. His record as a head coach is 132-79, 626 win percentage there. He's 8-7 as a head coach in the playoffs. So I think Sean Payton probably deserves a little bit more credit than we're giving him for the past 3 or 4 years when, Drew Brees' arm has been shot. They've been doing a lot of underneath stuff. To have as low of an average depth of target that the Saints have had the past few years, and for this team to have been as successful as they've been, is really a testament to Payton's ability to scheme people open. He does a good job of replenishing the team with weapons. Michael Thomas was a good find. Kamara was a good find. He's worked well with Brees. Obviously when Brees was at his peak, this team was very good offensively. He has won a Super Bowl. I think that, in general, he's a really good coach. He goes for it on 4th downs. He's got kind of an aggressive mentality, which is good. The downside with Sean Payton, I think, is that every now and then with the drafting process, I think sometimes he kind of sends too many draft picks away in trade-ups. The Marcus Davenport trade was kind of questionable. They give up multiple first-round picks for, an edge rusher who is good, not great. I just think that overall, it might have been helpful for the Saints to have had more than 3 draft picks this year stockpiled, because when the numbers get that low, I think that you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. But overall, Sean Payton, a very good and aggressive head coach. At number 4, I've got John Harbaugh from Baltimore, 120-75-0 as a regular season head coach, good for 61.5% winning percentage, 10-7 in the playoffs. I think Harbaugh is great at adapting. We're seeing what he's done with Lamar Jackson. I think, one point I wanted to make about the whole Lamar Jackson thing is that I think the common person probably looks at, what the Ravens are doing with Lamar and probably thinks the Ravens are good because of Lamar. And that's not wrong, but I think that Lamar is also good because of the situation he's in. Harbaugh having Greg Roman as the offensive coordinator, getting all these good run-blocking offensive linemen, bringing in tight ends who can block and catch the way that Andrews and Boyle can. There's just a lot of really good things that Harbaugh did to make the situation really good for Lamar. And I think that, if you gave Lamar a terrible O-line in a terrible offensive situation with a bad offensive play caller, I think that Lamar's value as a quarterback, rushing and passing, would actually decline a little bit more rapidly than people realize. I think that, he's done great, and he's done a great job of improving himself from, year 1 to year 2 to year 3. But, a lot of his success is a function of this Ravens team just being really good structurally. Harbaugh's done a great job of building defenses as well. Another guy who understands that you want to build it from the back to the front. They go out and get Marlon Humphrey. They've got, they tried to get Earl Thomas. Obviously that didn't work out, but, the thought process was there. They trade for Marcus Peters. they've always had good corners. They have not always had elite edge rushers. And so, despite that, over time, the Ravens defense has been really good. And then, on top of everything I've already said, Harbaugh won a Super Bowl with Joe Flacco, and Flacco obviously played really well during that run, but, this team was really good for a long time, and I don't think Flacco was necessarily one of the 10 or 12 best quarterbacks in the league for most of his tenure in Baltimore. So really good on Harbaugh for everything he's done. Very good and willing to adapt. At number 3, I've got Kyle Shanahan from San Francisco. So Kyle Shanahan has a regular season record of 25-26, only 49% winning percentage. He's 2-1 in the playoffs. I think the more important numbers to kind of look at with Shanahan is, with Jimmy Garoppolo as the quarterback, Kyle Shanahan's record is 20-6 in the regular season. That's almost 77% winning percentage. He's 2-1 in the playoffs. Even with Nick Mullins, who I think has been the best backup caliber quarterback that, Shanahan has worked with, Nick Mullins' record as the starter with San Francisco is 4-5. So not nearly as bad as the rest of the losses that Shanahan has endured because of just having like a super incompetent quarterback. Kyle Shanahan to me is an offensive wizard. I really do think he's bordering on being a genius, I would say. The way he schemes people open is really second to none. I mean, the things he does with tight ends and running backs and the advanced concepts of his running game are pretty staggering. He is one of the most creative offensive play callers, I would say, in the NFL. And I think Shanahan is really good at identifying like which types of players work in his specific system. So I like Kyle Shanahan a lot. Every now and then I think he falls into the Sean Payton, maybe even Sean McVay category, where like I think sometimes they give up too many draft picks, but that was only really this past season, and even with the lower draft capital, this team has still looked really good, and that's also in spite of a flurry of injuries to valuable positions across their roster. So I think Shanahan has proven to me that he's a wizard. Number 2, I've got Andy Reid, and that obviously means that number 1 is Bill Belichick. So start with Reid here with Kansas City. His record is 210, 128-1, 62.1 winning percentage, 15-14 in the playoffs. I just think Andy Reid is probably the best, quarterback developer in the NFL, one of the best in the history of the NFL. He deserves a ton of credit for the creative offensive play calling and scheming people open left and right. He's largely responsible for the terrific development of Patrick Mahomes, as well as Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill and a lot of these players that have had tremendous careers in Kansas City so far. The only knocks on Reid that I used to have were that he didn't like going for it on 4th downs very much, but he's started to do that a lot more. I don't know if people noticed it, but he definitely did it in the Super Bowl a little bit, and he's been doing it in the first few weeks here of the 2020 season, so good on Andy Reid for adapting. The only other criticism I have of him is that he neglected the position of corner for a long time, which I always thought was kind of almost ironic because he's an offensive guy and he knows how important it is to have good corners defensively, but he would definitely go cheap there quite a bit more than I would have personally gone cheap there. So, more recently, Charvarius Ward has developed. L'Jarius Sneed looks like a good player. They did draft Juan Thornhill as a safety coverage player, so they've been more kind of in tune with addressing the secondary more recently, but what can you say? Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes have been phenomenal. So at number 1, it's Bill Belichick. His record as a head coach is 275, 128-0. That's good for a 68.2 win percentage. In the playoffs, he's 31-12, over a 72% winning percentage in the playoffs for Bill Belichick. I think Belichick is not only the best coach in the history of the NFL, but probably the best coach in the history of sports when you think about how long he's been doing this and how consistently great the Patriots have been. The Patriots, I think, in Belichick's career are over like 60% against the spread in any given game. I mean, that to me is just really shocking. I think that it just shows that Belichick has always been ahead of the curve in a way that no one else has really ever been in any sport. And he just always seems to understand where there's an edge and, how to exploit it. I think he's definitely the best game plan oriented coach in the NFL. I think he studies relentlessly against his opposition and knows how to exploit their weaknesses better than anyone else. And I think he's also terrific at kind of bringing out the best in the players that he has on his roster, kind of working towards their strengths. Obviously, he's had Tom Brady for his career as a head coach, but in the games where Brady hasn't been there, Belichick's been really good. In 2008, Tom Brady gets hurt week 1. A 7th-round pick named Matt Castle steps in, and the team still wins 11 games that year. Jimmy Garoppolo and Jacoby Brissett both looked pretty sharp in the beginning of the 2016 season when Brady was suspended for those 4 games. And Cam Newton has looked good so far with Belichick and with McDaniels as the offensive coordinator. I think an underrated point that I'm going to make here is that Brady developed into what he was largely because of the infrastructure of Bill Belichick as the head coach. It doesn't mean that Brady isn't, uniquely gifted and amazing in several different ways, but I think the true, mastermind behind the Patriots dynasty has always been Bill Belichick, and that's a big reason why I've been on the Patriots over win total this year, why I like them to win the AFC East still, despite Buffalo looking good at the start of the season. I just trust the infrastructure of the organization so much. I think that they're so willing to adapt. They're so good at creating game plans. They're so good at just knowing themselves and the opposition inside out. They really are kind of distanced in a way from every other organization in the NFL from like a strategic perspective. So that'll wrap up this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening.